Two little girls were crying alone in a hospital corridor, clutching their teddy bears, and only one man stopped to ask why, a millionaire CEO whose question would change their lives forever. In the city of Dallas, inside a hospital that smelled faintly of disinfectant and loneliness, two small girls stood in the middle of a long corridor. The walls around them were painted a dull shade of white, the kind of color that swallowed warmth instead of giving it, and the flickering lights above hummed softly, filling the silence that pressed on every corner of the place. The twins, Lily and Sophie, were only 6 years old, yet the weight of the world already seemed to bend their tiny shoulders. Their blonde hair fell in soft waves, almost identical in every strand, and their large blue eyes glistened with tears that rolled down their pale cheeks. They were dressed alike, in delicate light pink dresses that had once been meant for laughter and birthdays, but now hung heavy with sadness. Each girl clutched a teddy bear as if it were the only anchor keeping them from sinking completely into despair. Lily held a small white bear with a stitched smile, while Sophie hugged a pink one, its fur damp where her tears had soaked it. They pressed the toys close to their chests, searching for comfort, but the stuffed animals could not answer the questions that lived in their hearts. They had been in this corridor for hours, sometimes whispering to one another, sometimes falling into silence so deep that even their breaths seemed too loud. Doctors and nurses hurried past, their footsteps echoing sharply, but no one stopped long enough to notice two small souls drowning quietly in sorrow. Their mother, Emily, lay only a few doors away, her fragile body connected to machines that breathed and pulsed in her place. The girls had been told that she was sleeping, but it was not the kind of sleep they understood. This was a sleep that frightened them, a sleep that did not end when the sun rose, a sleep that carried no dreams or lullabies. Their father had left long ago, vanishing from their lives without looking back, and so they had no one else to lean on. They were alone, truly alone, except for each other. The corridor itself seemed to mirror their despair. Cold air drifted along the tiled floor, carrying with it the faint echo of sobs from other rooms, the sharp beeping of machines, and the occasional call over the intercom. Lily's small hand trembled as she reached for Sophie's, and the two of them stood together, side by side, their eyes wide and full of fear. They tried to be brave, because that was what they thought their mother would want, but every few minutes the dam inside them broke, and the tears returned. To the adults rushing past, they were only two children waiting quietly, but in truth, their world had already cracked apart. The hospital felt endless to them, like a maze of doors leading nowhere, and the hours stretched into something timeless, as if the clock itself refused to move forward. They longed for a familiar voice, for the warmth of their mother's arms, for someone to tell them that everything would be all right. Yet the only answer they received was the hum of fluorescent lights and the hollow sound of their own muffled crying. The sound of polished shoes echoed across the sterile corridor, steady and deliberate, belonging to a man who did not belong in such a place. His name was Richard Morgan, though few would have recognized him there without the entourage and flashing cameras that usually followed his presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet authority that seemed to part the air around him. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, blue eyes missed nothing as they scanned the hallway. He wore a light blue suit that looked impossibly clean against the faded linoleum floors, the kind of suit that whispered wealth and power with every stitch. Richard had not come to this hospital by chance. One of his company's senior employees had fallen gravely ill, and despite his position, Richard believed in certain appearances, in gestures that reminded those who worked under him that he was more than just a name on the letterhead. But business was not what caught his attention as he turned the corner into that corridor. What stopped him was something so small and fragile that even his well-armored heart faltered for a moment. Two little girls stood by the wall, their matching blonde heads bowed, their cheeks streaked with tears that had left darkened spots on their pink dresses. They looked like porcelain figures placed in the wrong setting, delicate and out of place among the rushing doctors and harsh fluorescent light. Each held a teddy bear in her arms, one white, one pink, their worn fur clutched so tightly that Richard could see the tension in the small hands even from a distance. He slowed his pace without realizing it, his usual determination replaced with an unfamiliar hesitation. There was something about them that struck him deeply, though he could not have explained why in that first instant. Perhaps it was the way they seemed invisible to everyone else, two tiny islands of grief in a sea of hurried footsteps and clipped conversations. Perhaps it was the sound of their soft crying, barely audible but raw enough to carve its way through the noise of machines and voices around them. Or perhaps it was because, years ago, he had once known the sound of little girls crying, and the memory had never truly left him. Richard felt a pang of something that did not belong in the world of corporate meetings and billion-dollar contracts. Compassion, sharp and sudden, mixed with a deep ache he usually kept buried. He had promised himself long ago that he would never again open the locked doors of his past, never again let the memory of loss undo the life he had built from discipline and ambition. Yet here, in the middle of this hospital corridor, the sight of two children alone and forgotten made that promise tremble. He stopped walking, his polished shoes no longer striking the floor. For a moment he simply stood there, watching them, as if unsure whether approaching would shatter something fragile. The younger of the two shifted slightly, her grip tightening around her pink bear, and the sight tugged at him in a way that startled him. He drew in a slow breath, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket, and reminded himself that he was a man who thrived on decisions. Hesitation had never served him well. Without fully deciding, Richard took a step toward them. Then another. The corridor stretched longer than it was, every second measured by the sound of his footsteps approaching. The twins lifted their heads almost at the same time, two pairs of wide blue eyes fixing on him, startled and cautious. He saw in them not just fear, but a desperate longing for someone, anyone, to notice. Richard Morgan, who had built an empire and commanded boardrooms, suddenly felt the weight of an entirely different responsibility pressing down on him. He realized that in that moment, whatever words he chose next would matter far more than any speech he had ever delivered in his life. Richard paused just a few steps away from the girls, his usually confident stride softening into something uncertain, almost hesitant, as though he feared startling them by coming too close too quickly. He stood tall in the corridor, his figure casting a long shadow under the harsh white light, yet his eyes were fixed not on the grandeur of his own presence but on the two trembling children before him. For a man who had conquered markets, bent governments to his influence, and carried the weight of empires on his shoulders, the simple sight of two crying girls seemed more difficult to face than all of it combined. His throat tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice emerged quieter than he had intended, touched with an unfamiliar gentleness. "Why are you here all alone?" he asked softly, his words rolling into the silence like stones falling into a still pond. The nurses hurrying past seemed oblivious, their conversations about medications and charts echoing faintly in the background, but for the girls, his voice was the first that had addressed them directly in hours. Lily blinked at him, her lashes wet with tears, and pressed her white bear tighter against her chest. Sophie shifted closer to her sister, their small shoulders brushing together as though they could create a shield from the towering man before them. For a long moment they said nothing, their eyes darting from his polished shoes to his face, as if they were trying to decide whether this stranger in the immaculate suit was safe. Richard, used to commanding immediate respect and obedience, found himself waiting with a patience he never imagined he possessed. At last, Lily lifted her chin a fraction. Her lips trembled as she spoke in a thin, fragile whisper that carried more weight than the loudest of boardroom declarations. "Mommy is sleeping and won't wake up, we are waiting." The simplicity of the words hit Richard harder than he could have expected. He had been told many things in his life, but never had such a short sentence broken through the armor he wore so carefully around his heart. Sleeping. The word echoed in his mind with a cruel softness. He knew enough about hospitals to understand what that meant. His gaze flicked briefly toward the closed doors of the patient rooms, the silent machines behind them, and then back to the two small faces staring up at him. Sophie, emboldened by her sister's voice, spoke too, her blue eyes wide and glistening as she hugged the pink bear so tightly its head bent forward. "We don't want to leave her. If we leave, maybe she'll wake up and we won't be here." Richard's chest ached in a way it had not in years. He felt the memory of another hospital corridor, one that existed only in the shadows of his past, where his own daughters had once lain beyond doors that never opened again. For years he had buried those images beneath contracts, buildings, and profit margins, but now they surged back with punishing clarity. He could almost hear their voices overlapping with the two little ones in front of him, and for a terrifying instant, time blurred. He took a step closer, lowering himself slightly so he would not tower so menacingly above them. His voice was steady, but it carried an edge of emotion he could not conceal. "Where is your family? Who is here with you?" The girls exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication only twins understood, before Lily answered with a faint shake of her head. "Nobody. Just us." The corridor, with all its noise and bustle, seemed to fall away then. Richard stared at them, the image of two fragile children left utterly alone in a world too big and too cruel for them to survive without someone to stand at their side. He could feel the chill of the hospital seeping into his bones, but more than that, he felt the cold weight of what it meant for them to speak those words so plainly, without even the expectation of rescue. They were not complaining, not demanding, only stating the truth as they understood it, and that truth cut him deeper than any accusation could. He exhaled slowly, fighting the storm that rose inside him. These girls, so small and so undeserving of the pain pressed upon them, had spoken a single truth that dismantled the careful life he had built. He had asked a simple question, but the answer had changed something fundamental in him. He realized, standing there, that this moment would not pass like the others, and that he could not simply walk away as if it had never happened. The following hours revealed to Richard more than he had expected to learn. Once the twins trusted that his calm presence meant no harm, he found himself led, not by his own authority, but by the soft tug of Sophie's small hand toward the room where their mother lay. The sterile smell of antiseptic grew stronger as the door opened, and the steady rhythm of machines filled the silence inside. Emily, their mother, lay motionless on the hospital bed, her face pale and almost translucent under the cold light, with tubes and wires surrounding her like a fragile fortress. To Richard, who had walked into countless boardrooms filled with power and wealth, this room felt more intimidating than any of them, not because of what it held, but because of what it lacked: hope. The doctors explained in low voices the reality of her condition. Emily had been in a car accident several weeks before. The impact had left her with severe head trauma, and though she had survived the initial surgeries, she had not regained consciousness. They used the word coma as if it were just another medical term, but Richard could see how it carried the weight of despair. They said there was no guarantee she would ever wake again, and even if she did, her recovery would be long, difficult, and uncertain. The girls listened too, though the words were far beyond their understanding. To them, their mother was only sleeping, and sooner or later, she would open her eyes. They clung to that idea with a stubbornness that only children could hold. But Richard, standing there with his hands folded tightly behind his back, understood every syllable the doctors did not say aloud. He recognized the hesitation in their tones, the guarded expressions in their eyes, the resignation hidden between professional lines. He asked about the financial situation, though he already sensed the answer. Emily had been a schoolteacher, working long hours to support her daughters. There was no health insurance that could cover such extensive treatment, no savings large enough to pay for months or even years of care. Without intervention, the doctors admitted reluctantly, she would be transferred out of intensive care to a facility with fewer resources. The girls would be sent to child services, and the system would take over. Richard stood still as the weight of the truth settled on him. Two children who had already lost the steady warmth of their father were now on the verge of losing the only parent who remained. He imagined them wandering through foster homes, clutching those same teddy bears until their fur grew thin and ragged, their trust in the world eroded by the indifference of strangers. It was a vision so vivid that he had to press a hand against the edge of the hospital bed to steady himself. He glanced at Emily, at her fragile body lying as though suspended between this world and the next, and he wondered about the life she had lived. He saw the worn shoes at the side of the bed, the modest handbag sitting on the chair, and the drawings her daughters had taped to the wall in bright colors, as though their innocence could keep her tethered. This was not a woman who had known luxury, yet her daughters looked at her as though she were the entire universe. The thought clawed at him. He, a man with access to everything money could buy, stood paralyzed in front of a situation that no amount of power had yet touched. But beneath the fear and the helplessness, something stirred, something raw and dangerous that he had spent years burying under polished speeches and calculated decisions. It was the memory of loss, of his own daughters, of a hospital where hope had slipped through his fingers before he could grasp it. He felt his chest tighten as he realized he was staring at a mirror of his past, and for the first time in years, the armor he wore so carefully began to crack. The doctor's voice trailed off with a final phrase that sounded almost apologetic. "There's little more we can do without proper funding, Mr. Morgan." Richard did not answer immediately. He looked again at the girls, who had curled up together on the visitor's chair, one head resting on the other's shoulder, both still holding their teddy bears as if they believed those small figures of cloth could guard them against the vastness of their fear. And in that moment, Richard knew that the choice was no longer about money, nor even about obligation. It was about the fact that fate had placed him here, now, and demanded to know whether he would look away again or finally act. That night Richard could not bring himself to leave the hospital. He had walked the length of the corridors several times, his expensive shoes tapping against the worn floor tiles, his reflection catching in the darkened windows that overlooked the city. The skyscrapers outside glowed with lights from offices he himself owned, symbols of an empire he had spent decades building, yet none of them brought him comfort. Instead, he found himself haunted by the sight of the two small girls who had fallen asleep in the waiting chairs, their heads resting against each other, their teddy bears held tight even in slumber. He had watched as a nurse draped a thin blanket over them, her movements gentle but rushed, and then hurried away, leaving them once more forgotten in the current of hospital life. He sat in the quiet of the hospital chapel for a long time, a place he had not stepped into for years, his thoughts circling back to his own past. Memories he had buried deep clawed their way back to the surface with a force that left him shaken. He remembered the smell of antiseptic, the echo of footsteps, the suffocating dread that had consumed him when doctors told him there was nothing more they could do for his own children. He had promised himself he would never allow such weakness to control him again, and so he had hidden behind work, wealth, and the image of a man who could not be broken. Yet now, confronted with two strangers' daughters, he felt the cracks spreading through the carefully constructed walls around his heart. By the time dawn began to wash pale light across the hospital windows, Richard had made his decision. It was not calculated, not weighed against profits or risks, not the kind of decision that could be drafted into a contract. It came from a place far more dangerous to him, a place he had tried to silence for years. He sought out the doctors who had spoken to him the day before and asked them to gather. His voice when he addressed them was steady, but beneath it there ran a current of emotion he did not attempt to disguise. He told them he wanted everything possible done for Emily. Every surgery, every treatment, every ounce of medicine and expertise that could be brought to bear, no matter the cost. He would cover it all, personally, without hesitation. He demanded that they bring in specialists, that no option be left unexplored, that her chances of waking be given every possible push fate and science could provide. His words carried the authority of a man who was used to being obeyed, but there was something more in them too, something almost pleading. The doctors exchanged wary looks. They were not used to men like Richard Morgan stepping into their world with such conviction. One of them began to protest that money could not guarantee miracles, but Richard cut him off with a firmness that silenced the room. He was not asking for guarantees, only for the fight to continue. He could live with uncertainty, but he could not live with knowing that no one had tried. When the meeting ended, Richard stepped back into the corridor and looked once more at the twins. They were awake now, their small faces puffy with sleep, their eyes cautious but curious as they watched him. For the first time in years, he crouched down to meet children at their level. He reached out a hand, not to shake or to command, but simply to offer a silent promise. He did not tell them everything, for they were too young to understand the depth of what he had set in motion, but he spoke words that were simple and true. You are not alone anymore." And in that moment, as their small fingers curled hesitantly around his hand, Richard knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return, but also one he did not want to retreat from. It was not a business transaction, not charity, not an act meant for public recognition. It was a decision of the heart, one that bound him to these children and their mother in a way he could not have anticipated, but in a way that suddenly felt more necessary than anything else he had ever done. Weeks unfolded slowly within the walls of the hospital, each day marked not by meetings or deadlines as Richard had been accustomed to, but by the rhythm of machines, the quiet shuffle of nurses' shoes, and the patient endurance of two little girls who refused to let go of their hope. Emily remained in her coma, her face serene yet distant, while her daughters spent their hours between the sterile room and the corridor that had become a second home. What changed, however, was that they were no longer alone in their waiting. Richard came every morning without fail, his presence as steady as the sunrise, and in time his tall figure in the pale blue suit became as familiar to the girls as the doctors and nurses who hurried by. He began in small ways. At first he would bring them breakfast, not the bland hospital meals but warm pancakes, fresh fruit, and hot chocolate topped with cream. He noticed how their eyes lit up at the sight, how even Sophie, the more timid of the two, began to smile as she licked chocolate from her fingertips. Later he brought storybooks, some new, some classics he had once read aloud long ago, and he would sit cross-legged on the cold tile floor, reading in a voice that surprised even himself with its softness. The twins would curl up beside him, their teddy bears tucked safely in their arms, and for those hours, the hospital faded into the background as they lost themselves in fairy tales. The nurses, who at first had only glanced curiously at the powerful man intruding into their domain, soon found themselves moved by his dedication. They whispered among themselves about the strangeness of it, a man whose name was spoken in boardrooms now sitting patiently in a corner drawing pictures with crayons, but their whispers carried respect rather than mockery. They saw the way the girls began to laugh again, the way their nervous tears turned into bursts of chatter when he arrived, and they understood that something important was happening far beyond medicine. Richard, too, felt the shift inside himself. He no longer checked his phone every minute, no longer worried about the endless flow of emails or the fluctuations of the market. Instead, his focus narrowed to the curve of Sophie's smile, the determined way Lily tried to read aloud even when she stumbled over words, the quiet sigh that escaped Emily's lips as though somewhere in the depths of her sleep she recognized the voices around her. The empire he had built seemed suddenly small compared to the fragile kingdom of 3 lives that had come to depend on him. And yet beneath the warmth that grew between them, there remained the heavy shadow of uncertainty. Every evening, after the girls finally drifted to sleep, Richard would step into Emily's room alone. He would stand by her bed, looking at the pale figure lying so still, and he would feel the sharp ache of helplessness return. He spoke to her sometimes in a low voice, words he had not planned and did not fully understand, telling her about her daughters, about their courage, about the way they waited for her with unwavering faith. He told her that she was not alone either, that he had made a promise to fight for her, and though there was no answer, he imagined that somewhere deep within her unconsciousness she might be listening. As the weeks passed, the medical team threw themselves into her case with renewed vigor, encouraged not just by the financial resources Richard had poured into their hands but by the strange, undeniable hope that surrounded the family. Specialists were flown in, new treatments were attempted, therapies were tested, and though progress was measured in the smallest increments, no one allowed despair to win. Every time the doctors faltered, Richard's steady insistence pushed them forward, and every time the girls grew tired of waiting, his presence reminded them that they were not waiting alone. It was not an easy battle. There were nights when the machines beeped in ways that made his heart freeze, mornings when the doctor's reports grew heavier, days when exhaustion carved itself into the children's faces and he wondered if his faith had been misplaced. But each time doubt rose, he saw Lily holding Sophie's hand, whispering that their mother would come back, and he realized that if 2 children could believe with such strength, then he had no right to give up. By the end of the 6th week, the hospital staff no longer looked at Richard as an outsider. He had become part of the quiet life that pulsed through those halls, a fixture as constant as the hum of electricity. And though Emily still lay silent, something intangible had changed. The girls no longer looked like abandoned souls adrift in a sea of indifference. They were cared for, shielded, and above all, seen. And for Richard, who had once vowed never to open his heart again, it was both the most terrifying and the most necessary choice he had ever made. It was a quiet morning, the kind that seemed to arrive with no warning, when the ordinary turned into something unforgettable. The sun had only just begun to filter through the narrow hospital windows, painting faint lines of gold across the walls, and the corridors were unusually still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Richard had arrived before dawn, as he so often did, and found the twins already awake, their small bodies curled together in the chair by their mother's bed. Sophie had her pink bear pressed to her chest, while Lily clutched the white one so tightly it seemed strained. Their eyes, though heavy with sleep, never strayed far from the pale figure of their mother. Sophie, with her quiet determination, climbed onto the edge of the bed and wrapped her small fingers around Emily's hand. Her voice, soft but clear, drifted through the room. She told her mother that they were still waiting, that they loved her, that everything would be fine because they weren't alone anymore. She spoke about the man who came every day, the one who brought them books and food and sat with them when the nights grew too frightening. She told Emily about how he made them feel safe, how he reminded them that they were not invisible. And then, leaning close, she whispered words that seemed too wise for a child her age. "Mommy, wake up. We are not alone anymore. Please come back to us." The silence that followed was the kind Richard had come to know too well, a silence heavy with longing and fear, a silence he had learned to accept as unbroken. He stood in the corner of the room, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the fragile figure that seemed to hover between life and memory. But then, in the smallest of movements, something changed. Emily's fingers twitched beneath her daughter's hand. It was not much, only a faint stir, but it was enough to send a rush of air into Richard's lungs as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The monitors began to pick up a stronger rhythm, subtle but distinct. Lily gasped and rushed to the bedside, her eyes wide with disbelief. She moved. Sophie, she moved. Her words broke into laughter and tears at once, the joy spilling out so raw that the nurses who rushed into the room stopped in their tracks. Richard stepped forward slowly, his heart pounding in a way it had not in years, and for a moment he simply stood by the bed, watching the impossible unfold. Emily's eyelids fluttered, uncertain at first, as though fighting through layers of darkness, and then finally opened. Her blue eyes, pale and unfocused, blinked against the light. Her gaze wandered, searching, until it fell on the two small faces pressed close to her. She struggled to form words, her lips moving with effort, and though her voice was barely a whisper, the girls understood. "My girls." The sound of her voice, fragile though it was, broke the dam of silence that had held them for weeks. The twins burst into tears, but these were no longer the tears of despair. They clung to her, their small bodies shaking with relief, and the room filled with a chorus of sobs and laughter that drew even the doctors to pause. One of them muttered under his breath that it was nothing short of a miracle, but Richard knew better. He knew it was the strength of two children's faith, the persistence of love that refused to let go, and perhaps, just perhaps, a measure of fate that had chosen to intervene. He watched the reunion from only a step away, but it felt as though he stood on the edge of something vast and uncharted. His heart, which had carried the weight of grief for so long, now swelled with something dangerously close to hope. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that some endings could be rewritten, that not every story had to close with loss. As Emily's hand tightened around her daughter's fingers and her gaze flickered to him with a faint, questioning recognition, Richard felt the truth settle deep within him. The miracle was not only hers, it was his as well. The weeks that followed Emily's awakening passed in a haze of fragile joy and slow recovery. The hospital that had once felt like a place of endless despair now carried a different kind of energy, one filled with cautious optimism and moments that seemed brighter than the sterile walls should have been able to contain. Emily's strength returned in small increments, At first she could only move her fingers and whisper a few words, but soon she was sitting up in bed, her eyes alert, her smile faint but undeniable when her daughters rushed into her arms. The twins, who had endured so many nights in fear, now seemed to shine with relief, their laughter filling the corridors that had once echoed only with their sobs. Richard remained close throughout her recovery, though not in the way of a man imposing himself. He was simply there, a steady presence who brought warmth into every visit. He handled the endless bills without ever mentioning them, ensuring the best specialists and therapies continued without interruption, but beyond that, he gave his time. He would sit quietly as Emily regained her strength, sometimes speaking with her when she felt able, other times simply watching the way the girls curled against her, as though making up for all the days they had spent apart. His own heart, which had long been locked behind walls of power and distance, softened more each day. When Emily was finally discharged, stepping carefully out of the hospital doors with her daughters clinging to her hands, Richard was waiting. He had arranged for their modest home to be repaired and refurnished, stocked with food, books, and all the little comforts they had gone without. It was not a display of wealth meant to impress, but an act of quiet respect, a recognition of the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Emily, though overwhelmed, accepted with gratitude, her eyes shining not with dependence but with the relief of a mother who no longer had to fight alone. The bond between them grew in the simplest of ways. Richard began to visit their home in the evenings, sometimes bringing dinner, sometimes helping the girls with their schoolwork, often just listening to their endless chatter. The twins adored him, their trust absolute, and in their company he rediscovered pieces of himself he thought had been lost forever. He read them stories, built towers of blocks, laughed at their small jokes, and in the quiet moments, when they had drifted to sleep, he would share gentle conversations with Emily about the strange paths life had taken to bring them together. For Richard, who had once measured success by numbers and towering buildings, the meaning of achievement began to shift. When colleagues asked about his greatest accomplishments, he found himself thinking not of mergers or contracts, but of two little girls with blonde hair and blue eyes who had taught him how to feel again. And when he saw Emily, stronger each day, her laughter returning slowly after so much pain, he realized that fate had granted him something far more precious than fortune. The story that had begun with tears in a lonely hospital corridor found its conclusion not in tragedy, but in the creation of something new. It was not a fairy tale in the traditional sense, there were scars that would never fully fade, and memories that would always linger, but it was a story of survival, of faith, and of love rediscovered in the most unexpected way. Richard understood now that life had offered him a second chance, not just to save others, but to save himself. And so, when the world asked him what defined him, he no longer spoke of corporations or wealth. Instead, he spoke quietly of a day when he had noticed two small girls crying in a hospital corridor, and how in that moment everything he thought he knew about life had changed. In the end, what strikes me most about this story is not the wealth of the man or the tragedy that began it, but the fragile thread of humanity that tied them all together. It shows how even the smallest, most forgotten lives can stir the heart of someone who thought he had nothing left to give, and how love, once buried under grief and ambition, can be reborn in the most unexpected of places. For me, this tale is not only about survival and second chances, but also about the truth that sometimes one quiet question, asked at the right moment, can change the course of many lives forever.